So what's exposure bracketing and why would you use it? I'm going to talk about it in today's episode of
Ask David Bergman.
Hey everybody, welcome back. Here I am as always answering your photography questions. Don't forget to go to AskDavidBergman.com, ask your own questions there, and I just might answer it right here on a future show. Today I have a question from Rahul S. and he asked, could you please explain exposure bracketing and how this could be useful in photography? Rahul, great question. Exposure bracketing. First, let's back up and I'm going to explain exactly what that means. What we're talking about when we say exposure bracketing is really taking multiple images at different exposures from lightest to darkest, right? So now why would we do that? Let's back up to the film days. Back in the old days when we were shooting film, we used to use exposure bracketing mostly because we couldn't see the images like we can now with digital. So if you were shooting something, let's say a landscape where you're locked down on a tripod, nothing's moving, or maybe a still life or something like that, and especially if you were shooting slide film where you had very limited latitude, if your exposure was just a little bit over or a little bit under, you might not have the best image. So you would shoot multiple images at different exposures so that afterward, when you got the film back, you could pick the one frame that was just perfect. Now in the digital world, we have a lot of other tools at our disposal, one of them being the fact that we can see the images on the back of the camera right away. So really that's a non-issue because we can see the exposure and we don't have that uncertainty about whether we nailed the exposure or not. However, there still are some good reasons to use exposure bracketing. One of them being, if you're shooting JPEG images, which I hope you're not, I hope you're shooting RAW files, but if you're shooting JPEG, you really don't have the same kind of latitude that you do with a RAW file. I did an episode recently where I talked about highlight tone priority, which is a Canon setting that in the camera pulls down some of the highlights so that you don't blow them out, but there's still a limit as to what you can do there. By using exposure bracketing, you can give yourself a much wider latitude to make decisions after the fact in post. Now, you can do this and you make way over the top HDR images, or you can use it the way I prefer, which is to really make your images look more natural. So I'm going to give you an example here and show you what I'm talking about. I went out earlier today and I took the drone out. I have the DJI Mavic Mini, which I love. It's a nice little beginner drone, basically. It's relatively inexpensive as far as drones go. And I am a beginner drone pilot, but I love flying this thing around. And I brought it up in the air. It's very common for a landscape image, especially if the light is just not perfect, it's not the right time of day or whatever, where the ground and the sky are both going to be in the image and they're going to be vastly different exposures. So let's go into photo mechanic here and I'm going to show you this scene that I just photographed just very quickly. It's not the most fantastic image, but just to give you an idea. Now, if you look closely here, the scene on the ground is pretty much exposed properly, maybe even a little overexposed, but of course the sky is completely blown out. There's no detail at all. Let's go and look at my settings. I'm at 100 ISO, 2.8 aperture, 2/40th of a second shutter. I'm not sure why that Mavic Mini doesn't shoot at 250, but it's 240 for some reason. Here's the thing, the Mini only shoots JPEGs, it does not shoot RAWs. So if this was the frame that I took, it's all I would have. I would not have any detail in the sky. So what I did was I bracketed my images and I made multiple frames at different exposures. So as I took my shutter speed up and sped up my shutter speed, I went one stop at a time and I shot 5 separate images. So the next frame was here at 1/500th of a second. Now you can see the ground is getting a little darker. That's probably about the right exposure for the ground, where I haven't really lost any shadow detail in the darkest areas. Everything looks pretty normal. The sky still, it's got some more detail than it did before, but it's still blown out in here, right? Then I go to 1,000th of a second. The ground is getting a little bit darker. The sky also bringing in some more detail, but there's still some areas that are blown out. Then 2,000th of a second, I've got most of the detail in the sky here, maybe a couple of spots that are just blown out. And then just to be safe, I went to 4,000, so I had all of that extra detail. Now, a lot of people, when they do exposure bracketing, they photograph the middle and then they go one stop over and one stop under. In most cases, that's going to be enough. Me personally, I like to go 2 stops over and 2 stops under, just because why not? If I don't use those far images from both ranges, that's okay, but I'd rather have them. In this case, I'm flying the drone, it's windy, I don't know how long I'm going to be able to stay up there, there's battery power, there's all kinds of other issues, so I'm going to make sure I've got the whole range of images to work with. So then what do I do with those images? Well, there's really two ways to handle it. There's automated and manual. If you want to do the automated route, which works perfectly well, my favorite program is HDR Efex Pro. It's by a company called DXO. They make a suite of software. It was originally developed by Nik Software, then Google bought it, and then DXO thankfully resurrected this suite. They also make a great piece of software called Silver Efex Pro, which is my go-to for everything black and white. But HDR Efex Pro, basically all you do, you come in here and you open your images, you tell it the 5 images in this case that I want to use, and I'm going to load them all in there. It's going to combine them together, and first thing it gives me this sort of opening screen of settings where there are a few things before it does the combining. One of them is if you want it to auto-align the images, which I do because in this case I was not on a tripod. The drone is moving around a little bit in the wind. The gimbal does a good job, but there's still going to be a little bit of movement. So I'm going to let it auto-align. There are things like ghosting reduction and chromatic aberration you can set in here. I'm going to leave those alone. And then it's going to go ahead and combine those. And what it's going to do is take the best parts of all 5 of those images. It's going to take the darkest part of the highlights and the brightest part of the shadows and combine them together into one single image. Now, we're not done yet. This is the default, how it starts out. But the cool thing about this program is that it's got 40 different presets, and they're all going to combine those images differently. So this is the neutral straight out of the box, right? You can go ahead and change it in all kinds of different ways. You can do stuff like that. You've probably seen those over-the-top, real dramatic HDR images like that. I personally am not a big fan of that. So a lot of people like that creative, way over-processed look. I personally, for my HDR, all I want to use high dynamic range for is to combine the images so that it looks natural. It looks like my eye saw it, and it's just outside of the range of what the camera, what a JPEG can really reproduce. So in this case, I found the Outdoor 2 setting does a pretty good job in getting it as close to natural as possible. So I'm going to start with that. All I have to do is save that out, and then I can open it in Photoshop and work with it there. It doesn't really need much, maybe just a little bit of levels or curves, whatever you prefer to work with. I'm going to bring up the highlights a little bit, maybe bring down the shadows a little bit so it looks a little more natural, maybe darken just a tad, and there you go. You've got one single image. Now, obviously, I'm working on this very quickly. If you really wanted to take the time to be more careful, you could do a lot more with it. The reason I would use the automated software with a picture like this is because there are a lot of overlapping areas, that tree coming into the sky, and I'm going to let the computer really figure out how to start with that image. But conversely, if I have images where it's a really simple mix of the 2 images, I might prefer to do it manually. So for example, I went out and shot another sequence, and what this is, as you can see, it's just a mix, a pretty solid mix of the trees and the sky. And the contrast is so extreme, it's really impossible to get the right exposure in one image. So all the way down at one end, it looks like this. This is 2/40th of a second, probably way overexposed, then 500th of a second, 1,000th of a second, 2,000, 4,000, and just to be safe, 8,000. That's probably way underexposed. But by giving myself those options, again, it gives me the chance to do whatever I want later. Now, in this case, I might prefer to do this manually, so I'm going to take, let's say, these 2 images. So this one where the trees look good, and this one where the sky looks good, and I'm just going to simply open those up in Photoshop. And I'm not going to do a big Photoshop tutorial here, but all I'm going to do is combine them into one image by layering them on top of each other, and then I'm going to have Photoshop auto-align them because, again, this drone is moving around in the wind, so they're probably not lined up perfectly. So I'm going to do that. All it needs is a little bit of a crop because some of that area is going to be outside of the image after the alignment. Go ahead and do that. And then all I'm going to simply do is by using layer masks, I can go ahead and draw in the area that I want to bring back in, right? So by just drawing that in, let's make sure my opacity is at 100. By just drawing in that ground there without touching the sky, I can bring it back in. And then by flipping it back, I can darken just a little bit. I might lower my opacity just for the transition area. Let's go to about 40%, just where they meet, where the sky meets the ground. So it's a little bit of a smoother transition. And then all I have to do is flatten that layer, and maybe again a little bit of a curves or levels, whichever you prefer, And right there, voila. Look, this was down and dirty. Again, I would spend more time making it look right, but it just gives you a good idea as to how you can combine these two images. This was such a simple one with a nice solid line and an easy transition. That image I could not make with one frame on the Mavic Mini because of the JPEGs. It's just too extreme outside the dynamic range. So Rahul, that's how I would use exposure bracketing. Again, you find your own way to make it work, but if you want to do that kind of photography, especially if you're working with landscapes or something like that, it's really a great way to have the option later to bring in that dynamic range and expand it so you can capture it just like your eye saw it. Thanks so much for asking that question. I really appreciate it. Listen, again, if you have your own photo questions, AskDavidBergman.com. That's the place. Make sure you fill out that form, and I just might answer it right here on a future show. Also, you're already here watching. Thanks to Adorama. There's so much great content from the folks at Adorama. It's a great photo store. It's where I buy all of my equipment. I hope you do too. Links for everything is down below. And every Monday, 10 a.m. Eastern, we're right here with a new episode. I'll see you back here next week on Ask David Bergman.